Good afternoon. I'm Andrew Blauvelt, director of the Cranbrook Art Museum. Thank you for sacrificing a sunny Michigan summer day to join us here. I think it'll be a very special treat, so I think it's good. And it's going to be way too hot anyway out there. So we're extremely pleased at Cranbrook Art Museum to be the U.S. debut of the exhibition Alexandra Girard, A Designer's Universe. It's a real treat to have a kind of homecoming for Alexandra Girard. As many of you might know, he had spent time in Michigan, particularly in Grosse Pointe, and he had spent time here at Cranbrook. So it's particularly noteworthy to be able to bring him back. His solo exhibition here was in January of 1947 of abstract sculptures, the likes of which seem to be upstairs. I can't confirm that because of our poor record keeping in 1947. It was 5 years after the building opened, but we're very excited. And this afternoon is a very special treat because we have with us Sam Graw and Amy Auscherman of Herman Miller, and who will be joined by Alexandra Girard Maxson and Corey Girard, who are the grandchildren of Alexandra Girard. Sam and Amy will provide some background and context for Alexandra Girard, and Alexandra and Corey will join Sam and Amy on stage for a conversation reflecting on their memories and experiences with their grandfather and their stewardship of the Alexandra Girard legacy. Now, if you haven't had a chance to see the exhibition upstairs, you most certainly can afterwards, and I recommend that you do that and that you probably come back, because Girard was very prolific. And this is simply a fraction of the material that exists on him. So we should thank Alexandra Girard for being meticulous in his documentation of his process and also the final product, which is simply amazing. I would also like to acknowledge that the exhibition was organized by the Vitra Design Museum in Germany, where it debuted last year, and was curated by Jochen Eisenbrand. And I'm not sure, I'm scanning the audience quickly to see if he's here this afternoon. He was just here over the weekend looking at all of the installation. And the reason for that is, in particular, was because the Alexandra Girard estate was acquired by the Vitra many years ago, and it's quite an extensive archive, and it's taken a long time to process and for scholars to be able to dig deep into it. And so we're having a lot of Girard scholarship lately, which is really long overdue and very exciting. I'd also like to thank the global sponsors of the exhibition, Herman Miller and Maharam, who have generously supported the creation and transportation of the show, particularly on its US tour, including here. And after its presentation here, it will travel to Seoul, South Korea, and return to the United States at the Berkeley Art Museum in California, and then on to the Museum of International Folk Art in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is a special place that you'll learn more about, and the Girard legacy. I would also like to thank Herman Miller Cares for their support of the exhibition's educational programming. And I'd like to mention that if this will just kind of whet the appetite, I think, this afternoon. And if you become converted to the Girard cause, we will have a one-day symposium on July 22nd from 1 to 4 in this room. We will have Girard scholars, including Deborah Kawsky, who is based here in the Detroit area, who's finishing her book on Girard's time in Detroit with a focus on his architectural practice here, which is quite interesting and heretofore a little bit mysterious for a lot of the scholars. Our other speakers will include Alexandra Lange, who's the national architecture critic for Curb Magazine, and Monica Obniski, who's curator at the Milwaukee Art Museum, who are both contributors to the excellent exhibition catalog, which I can highly recommend to you as well. So I'd like to introduce today's presenters. See, Alexandra Maxson Girard and Corey Girard operate Alexandra Girard Studio, which was formed by the Girard family to help preserve and promote the legacy and archive of Alexandra Girard. Girard Studio is the official representation for Alexandra Girard's unique and prolific body of work. As I mentioned earlier, they are the grandchildren of Alexandra Girard. We're also lucky to have with us today in the audience Marshall Girard, their father and son of Alexandra Girard. Welcome. So to help us introduce us to the world of Alexander Girard, we have Amy Auscherman, who's the archivist for Herman Miller, a Zeeland, Michigan-based purveyor of modern furniture, furnishings, and office equipment. She came to Herman Miller from the Indianapolis Museum of Art, where she was the archivist for the Miller House in Columbus, Indiana, which I can also highly recommend as a special day trip for you. Supervising the documentation of extensive records of the house, a work created by architect Eero Saarinen, and it was acquired by the Indianapolis Museum of Art. And of course, it was a collaboration with interior architecture by Alexander Girard and landscape architecture by Dan Kiley. The Miller House, as I mentioned, was acquired by the Indianapolis Museum of Art, which operates, cares for, and interprets this landmark residence. Auscherman studied art history at Indiana University and received her master's degree in library science, also from IU. Joining Amy will be Sam Graw, who's the global brand director for Herman Miller. Graw studied architecture and architectural history before taking a position at Dwell magazine, where over several years he helped build the brand and expand the magazine's platform across various media and live engagements. As editor-in-chief of Dwell, he is responsible for the creative direction for print, online, and live events. He is a frequent speaker on design issues and, of course, a major fan, as they are both, of Alexander Girard. So please help me welcome Amy Auscherman and Sam Graw.
Thank you, Andrew, for the kind introduction. I think we're going to split the difference somehow on the microphone here. As Andrew mentioned, Amy and I are both incredible fans of Mr. Girard's work, and it's exciting to see it out in the world and increasing in its prominence. It first came to my attention probably about 15 years ago, and it was like this sort of fabled bit of Herman Miller's history with really wonderful, beautiful things. And I was fortunate enough in like 2008 or so to venture to Santa Fe. The Museum of International Folk Art, as Andrew mentioned, truly is like, I call it the eighth wonder of the world. That's like Girard's Gemunstkunstwerk or whatever it is. It's like this. It's an amazing experience to go there. It will change your world forever. But it's been great to see this work appear and reappear in the popular sphere. We're going to try to very quickly go through 175 slides to give you a picture of Mr. Girard's work. We'll keep it pretty light and breezy and give you, I think, a good overview to his involvement with Herman Miller, where he was the leader of our textiles division for 21 years. I'm not going to go too deeply into the story of Herman Miller because that would take another few hours, but the man on the left is our founder, DJ Dupree. DJ had a number of sort of fortuitous moments in his career which led him to working with some of the world's greatest designers. The first was with Gilbert Brody, and then Mr. George Nelson, Charles and Ray Eames, and finally the man on our right, Alexander Girard, who did not always have to stay in the textile closet. And in the course of our research, we've been working on a book about Herman Miller for some years now, and I turned up a really great statement that Mr. Girard made on his work, which in relation to Herman Miller, I think is really apt. He wrote, every new project presents some version of basic order. In it, the ingredients for the exercise of fantasy and magic can usually be found. These ingredients, if discovered and used significantly, can give special individuality and identity to the project or the client, or better, both. When the client joins in the search, the ideal conditions exist for the realization of the best solution to the project. My greatest enjoyment and satisfaction in the solution of any project is uncovering the latent fantasy and magic in it, and convincing my client to join me in the process. I think DJ needed very little convincing. And certainly we are left with a great legacy of fantasy and magic in Mr. Girard's work. Mr. Girard is, in my experience of researching him, a man of very few words, but those words that he did leave us are incredibly potent. Part of how he came to Herman Miller was through his friendship with Charles and Ray Eames, who are pictured here with Mr. Edgar Kaufman as well. That is a Knoll table they are sitting at, however. Actually, upstairs, as you venture into the exhibit, there is, I believe, a wood cutout sort of model of the dog that he is holding, worth seeking out. The Eameses and the Girards had a wonderful lifelong friendship. We were recently at the Library of Congress in our research of the Eames and came across this fabulous document, a postcard to Signor Carlos Eames from Sandro. The double heart is a sans souci, two interlocked S's for Sandro and Susan. In some regard, even in his corporate work, the work of Girard is sort of one long love letter to his bride. This letter also is a wonderful piece because somewhere down along the bottom where you see the sort of icon of a lounge chair, there's a little note where Ray is writing to Charles and saying Sandro's best contribution was tilting the arms back, calms and makes it look like a chair. So, you know, they were friends in life and friends in work and had this wonderful lifelong relationship. How they came to, and we're going to give you some sort of taste of all the projects where those things interconnected. One of the first of which was an exhibit at the Detroit Institute of Arts in 1949, of which there are some wonderful artifacts and images upstairs. Perhaps the most fantastic of which is this. I really encourage everyone here to spend the 10 minutes or half an hour or whatever it takes in front of this document on tissue paper to read through Mr. Girard's sort of theory or thesis on modernism. It is truly a beautiful statement that is just as relevant today as it was in 1949.
Live your way, not your grandma's. That's my favorite.
I'm a fan of let the sun in, and also colors are yours to use, not for fashion to dictate. Note to Anna Wintour. The Detroit Institute of Arts. This exhibit was really sort of exemplified all of Mr. Girard's talents in some ways. There was a background of modern design. There was a wonderful Saul Steinberg mural. In the Hall of Objects, over 3,000 items that were deemed to be modern and fit with his theory were exhibited beautifully. And then the really interesting part was they used this large atrium or sort of large space in the halls to create a series of rooms really with every significant designer of the age, from Eames and Nelson to Alto and Rism and Knoll, Saarinen, Albini, etc. So really a very interesting moment in design history. There is Mr. Girard testing out the Victorian sort of spring chair, showing the evolution of chairs. The Hall of Objects, the sort of parade of modern homes. Here's Mr. Nelson having a solitary moment with a cigarette. And Saul Steinberg contributed to the wonderful catalog, which if you can locate one is worth seeking out.
Girard had moved to the area, to Detroit, to work for first an interior design firm, but then later met Charles Eames through his work at Detrola. So that's how they first sort of got connected. But I feel like this exhibit is sort of one of the first times that you have Girard, Nelson, and Eames all in one place, even a few years before Girard came to Herman Miller.
One of the next sort of moments of connection with Herman Miller was Girard was invited to design a sort of attic space at the Grand Rapids Furniture Winter Market in 1951. He called it Space for an Open Mind. He utilized all Herman Miller products in the design, and then he created this fabulous tissue paper mural for the backdrop as well. And that sort of led directly to his involvement in our textile division.
So a year later, Girard joined Herman Miller as the head of the textile division, and that was sort of helped by Charles and Ray Eames and Nelson not being able to find suitable textiles for the furniture they were designing for Herman Miller. So they thought, hey, we know this guy, why not bring in the best? Also in our research, there's this really nice statement by Girard on his fabric design, so I'll let him tell it, but fabric design is not easel painting or illustrating, it is fabric design. Realism in printed fabrics should be avoided. Draped fabrics naturally distort any pattern. Unlike wallpaper, their design should respect their natural character. It is boring to be aware of endless pattern repeats. They should be as invisible as possible. Designs that are fresh, interesting, and different are not achieved if to be fresh, interesting, and different is the prime objective. Good design derives from the wish to do just that. So during his time at Herman Miller, he ended up designing over 300 textiles in a multitude of colorways, whether they were woven, printed, some of which now we still make with Maharam.
And I think really, if you look at this body of work, which is massive, we're still uncovering new things. He really explored every kind of conceivable technology, working with different mills all over the world, whether they were in Scotland or Belgium or Switzerland or Mexico. And sort of in his great way, being able to synthesize that and play with the sort of almost the architecture of the textile, and then obviously applying the wonderful colors and patterns that he's so renowned for as well. But I think even though these sort of colorful patterns are what he's so well known for and obviously delight the eye, there are no shortage of sort of utilitarian textiles or quieter pieces that fulfill this sort of complete line. The idea was this collection that could effortlessly intermix.
Surprisingly, there are also beige casement textiles that he did as well that were just as successful.
This is actually some material that we got sort of reacquainted with at the Henry Ford Museum in the last year or so in the course of our wanderings. They have a treasure trove of items from Mr. Girard's archive that came through Herman Miller. Here's our young archivist displaying a really rare piece called Cut Out, which I don't think we've seen anywhere else. It appears to have been made by like photocopying strips of paper and then cutting those and putting them back together. It's really always incredible to see his process. These are sort of documents of different colorways.
Girard was a better archivist than I will ever be in terms of just really completing a picture of his process. So you can see, oh, I'm making this stripe. How am I sort of workshopping this? Oh, and then every single stripe within this particular design has a number, is delineated. It's really amazing to see within all the archival material that exists between Herman Miller's corporate archive, the Henry Ford, Vitra Design Museum. We're constantly making new discoveries, so I think we'll continue
This is a really incredible piece. The Maharam people, the audience will forgive me because I still don't know warp and weft. One is vertical, one is horizontal. But if you look at this, like, it's incredible. There's red and green, and there's blue and orange, and somehow it comes together in this beautiful gold and purple design. But just really, like, his color sense and the ability to combine and play was always evident in his work.
When you even see in these sample books and everything else, just the ability to translate one design across a multitude of colors, or, you know, he was constantly playing with even just one design across a couple different options.
It's also like incredibly innovative in the way that textiles were presented to the customer. So these binder, which may look fairly standard by our 2017 eyes, was incredibly innovative in 1952 and when it was first presented.
One of my favorite elements of this from a graphic design and utilitarian perspective is you see these windows that kind of allow the client or the designer to sort of hold up and see how opaque or how not opaque the textile is. So if you're speccing something for your house or whatnot, you're able to do that with the fabric card itself.
If anyone in the audience has the Indian stripes designed by Alexandra Girard book, we could use one of those.
I can't find it.
Also, Girard obviously was sort of the consummate multi-talented designer, graphic design, trained as an architect, but that extended to everything, really. Graphic design was a big part of his contribution to Herman Miller, as these invitations and announcements attest.
Another sort of tie between, kind of like Sam showed, Eames's, Girard's, they were all really good friends and hanging out all the time. So Deborah Sussman, who worked in the Eames office, also carried out some graphic design for Girard as well. So you have that, kind of interplay between design minds contributing to each other's work for the larger body of work with Herman Miller.
These have wonderful copy if you can read it. But
Can you read it?
it says, how bright is a color? How light is a texture? How dark is light? How hot is pink? How straight is green? How soft is brown? How sharp is orange? Herman Miller, Mexicotton, is Alexandra Girard. Also, wonderful ads to the trade of the materials themselves.
Very
which
meta.
We always like
Ads
to see.
for ads.
Ads for ads. It's hard to come by color imagery. These are some of the nicer pics that we have. Black and white is no problem. But you can see this sort of effortlessly blends with the furniture and really added this layer to Herman Miller's world of this kind of richness and texture that wasn't there prior to that. As Corey and Alatial and Marshall can attest, one of the sort of most impactful moments in the course of Girard's career was the decision to relocate from Grosse Pointe to Santa Fe, which the family undertook in the mid-50s. Here's Mr. Girard looking a little unhappy about it, but I'm sure he was very happy about it. Here's a little better with his dogs. Santa Fe, my understanding is that obviously with the Santa Fe Railroad line, it was almost as close as he could come to living in Central or South America or in sort of a third world condition, but still be able to get to New York City in a couple days' time, or the coasts, as it were. And really from this sort of Santa Fe outpost is where he created the sort of bulk of his career. Renovated a sort of series of buildings over the course of that time. Just give you a wonderful sense of the lifestyle that they undertook there. Really interesting experimental floating dining table. Eames chairs. This is a project that was undertaken for Alcoa's Forecast program, which also involved designers like Elliot Noyes. I think was Marion Strengle involved, who's outside in the hallway. She did a piece for them. Isamu Noguchi did the prismatic table. Girard's
Eames
item.
did the solar
The solar do nothing machines from the Eames office. This was a shelving unit intended to display objects, which it appears to be doing well. Girard was a fan and innovator of the conversation pit. Here's one of his earliest in his Santa Fe home.
After this, you can go retire and think about this presentation in the conversation pit in the gallery.
The home was featured rather extensively in the media of the day. A lot of these images have been culled from press clippings.
Some of Herman Miller has a really amazing clippings file, and the most voluminous years are sort of early 50s, mid 50s, and you see a lot of publicity for the house, which ultimately ended up being great for Herman Miller because it put these designers out into pop culture. Because if you can imagine late 40s, early 50s, mid 50s, housewives like seeing this crazy, colorful, new, modern furniture and these post-war materials, like it's still astounding to me that this was accepted so widely and successful.
Adobe is a post-war material.
Sure.
Miss Susan Girard in her amazing kitchen. I don't know that there are any pictures of this upstairs, but the sort of like cooking measurements and trompe l'oeil paintings and bean mosaics are especially fantastic. They also somehow managed to still get French cheese out to Santa Fe. Here they are, enjoying a moment of respite. I'll let Amy take on the Miller House, one of Girard's more significant projects.
So J. Irwin Miller was head of Cummins Engine Company in Columbus, Indiana, which is south of Indianapolis. And if you're running engine company, hosting foreign businessmen and people from out of state, you needed somewhere to take and entertain them. There weren't a lot of places in Columbus, Indiana, surprisingly. So Mr. Miller sort of built this house. He was an amazing architecture patron, ended up helping fund, if you know of Columbus, a lot of the architecture is thanks to the Cummins Engine Company Architecture Fund, where they would pay the architect's fees for any civic buildings going up. So you have Eero Saarinen churches, Eliel Saarinen churches, Harry Weiss, pretty much everybody. So with this project, Mr. Miller had grown up with the Saarinens, engaged Eero to build this home for him, and Girard was also listed as an architect on the home. So again, another, you can see his process. So he laid out the house, kind of was seeing how textiles would go with one another. This amazing storage wall, which features, printed papers, textiles, kind of housed all of the Miller's, really important books or Stradivarius violins. And then obviously the conversation pit, where in the summertime you would have these pillows and then they'd be switched out in the winter. So there's this amazing record of all of the both Herman Miller and Indian and other, so many textiles from around the world that went into creating this pillowscape that changed twice a year. You also see elements from, so if you go back, that coffee table, the Girards had one similar in their own home, and Xenia Miller was literally like, hey, I really like that. Where'd you get it? And he's like, you can't. I found it overseas, but I'll fabricate one for you. So you see this interplay between Girard, kind of educating Xenia Miller about design and also getting her to develop her tastes. But then she also straight up would just be like, I want that in my house too. So can you make that happen? Again, this amazing, you just see the layering upon layering that's, at this point, you can see is very Girard. Custom Eames compact sofa that Herman Miller produced, and Girard also created custom furniture pieces around the house as well. This is the playroom with a custom carpet, and then multiform and quatrefoil as drapery in the children's areas. Kitchen, another Girard original rug that he designed, and then he also created these amazing tablescapes, sometimes using the work of his brother Toonsey, who also created ceramics that Herman Miller sold for a time.
One of the first sort of consummate projects that Girard undertook with Herman Miller was the design of our San Francisco showroom. There's a wonderful anecdote in Hugh Dupree's book, Business as Unusual, about Hugh, the son of DJ Dupree, the founder, and Girard and Charles Eames all going out to San Francisco to look for a new showroom, and they had looked at one space that was apparently above an old spice mill factory, and it smelled great. But then as they were wandering around the city, they came across this boarded up site that was on Pacific Street, formerly the Hippodrome, a sort of house of ill repute in the Barbary Coast era. And they peeled away the boards in front of it and had a peek at this amazing facade that had kind of been left to rot away. And they decided that this was the ideal location for Girard to undertake a showroom design, of which he also, of course, undertook the graphic program. But the transformation is typical of Mr. Girard's ability. Fantastic use of color, lighting, enjoying a cheerful moment with the storage wall. We came across a wonderful memo from Mr. George Nelson, who was writing, who sort of jokingly began by saying, today I'm going to fulfill my duty as Herman Miller's creative director and offer some thoughts. But he had a quite scathing comment. He wrote, had Sandro deliberately worked to make the furniture as inconspicuous as possible, he could not have been more successful. At every turn, attention is called to anything but furniture. Large display wall, $7,000. One of the most handsome things Sandro has ever done. Totally dominates a large area and yet contains nothing either as an accessory or as a structure that HM can sell. So entirely successful on Mr. Girard's part. This was, I think, from the sort of media that I've seen around the time, again, one of these projects that just sort of appeared everywhere, even in San Francisco in local menswear commercial, actually. So, but you get this sense of sort of the total environment and combinations really that only Girard would undertake. That sort of approach to total design was again evident in the La Fonda del Sol restaurant, which was opened in New York City in the Time Life building in 1960. The Time and Life building has a great sort of history with Herman Miller and all of the designers. The La Fonda del Sol restaurant was on the ground floor, which was designed by Girard. The Eames office, in thanks to Henry Luce for allowing images to be used in their slideshow for Moscow, designed the lobbies of Time and Life's offices on the 17th and 18th floor. And then on the top floor, where there was a corporate lunchroom during the day and a dinner club at night, the Hemisphere Club was designed by the Nelson office. So you kind of had this sort of consummate Herman Miller experience within the Time and Life building. There was a company called Restaurant Associates that was very adventurous and opened this Latin American themed cantina in 1960. And really Girard designed everything down to, Susan and him contributed to the menu itself. But really, like, from the matchbook and the sugar to the serving carts and the uniforms, he even collaborated with the Eameses to design a special chair for the restaurant, which is called the La Fonda chair. It's sort of based on the shell chair of 10 years earlier, but with a lower back that wouldn't disturb the tablescapes across the restaurant. So you'd have this kind of seamless tabletop level. That brass sun, there's a wonderful diagram of it in one of the cases upstairs, a blueprint for it. It was fabricated for Mr. Girard, but that's one of those sort of it's now the lost Inca gold of La Fonda del Sol.
What landfill is it in now?
That's a game we play sometimes. La Fonda del Sol too, like this, this is very similar to the way his kitchen was in his own house, these nichos, buildings within buildings, that sort of contained the bar actually. But this restaurant too, just like gained incredible press and notoriety at the time. These are images from like the equivalent of Sports Illustrated's swimsuit issue of its day. Fashion shoots from Vogue and like local retailers, and of course some great jazz album covers as well, sort of coincided with the bossa nova craze. And so it was really just this sort of consummate project where his travel and folk art collecting, his ability to transform interiors, and almost this notion of being able to, I think in a very modern way, Girard would be called an experience designer now. And I think that's where he sort of excelled in this notion of putting together an experience. And where in a sort of FAQ that he wrote for the restaurant, he talks about this idea of the significant group. And like, there's no one thing in La Fonda del Sol that if you're to pull it out is like super remarkable. But the magic comes when you put it all together, and that one thing talks to this thing, and that talks to this, and then you kind of have these layers within layers. So we all wish we could go have a chalupa there. That sort of coincided with one of sort of the great undertakings for Herman Miller. This came at a period in Herman Miller's history where we had founded a research division. We were looking at all kinds of ways that we might expand the business. And one of them obviously led us to being the contract office provider that we are today. Another that sadly was sort of cut short was this idea of delivering textiles and objects directly to consumers. So Girard, as the leader of the textile divisions, undertook this notion of creating a storefront where people could come in and look at fabrics, buy pillows, buy objects, including folk art that he selected, or objects that he recruited others like his brother Tunci, Giancarlo Girard, to design. Another wonderful graphic program. There's a shopping bag upstairs that's quite nice, sort of the mock-up for is here. The announcement poster has become collectible in its own right.
I think as you'll see with the photographs, I mean, Girard sort of pioneered I guess I would say like the Pier 1 or the world market, in the sense that you have this one-stop shop to get Mexican folk art or things that you would usually have to travel around to get, but he did that. Part of his job was getting to travel around the world, source all these objects, not only to sell at Herman Miller, but also ended up becoming the Folk Art Museum in Santa Fe.
It was also like very ahead of its time to place what were sort of very objects that weren't regarded as high art in a very sort of high art setting. Here's the invite to Mrs. and Mr. DJ Dupree, who are pictured with the Girards in the space at the opening here. And you get a sense for this wonderful interior. Richard Kelly served as a lighting consultant And it, again, was this sort of incredible retail design. And I think now retail, like curated retail, is a very common idea. Girard was, just as with most things, 50 years ahead of his time. You can see some of the objects, mirrors, textiles from India, textiles from Africa, objects from all over.
Those dolls were done by Marilyn Neuhardt, who worked with the Eameses.
This banner is actually now on display at the Henry Ford as a part of the House Industry Show. We uncovered it in the treasure trove of objects there. But here you get a sense of some of the goods that they had on offer, some incredible folk art items, which Marshall may have had a hand in shipping and repairing. Wonderful poster. The one on the left kind of features the objects that were made for T&O, like the Marilyn Neuhardt dolls and the mirrors and the pillows. On the right, you have a real amazing kind of collection of all of the global items. Also at the Henry Ford, we come across these sort of maquettes for the mirror designs. Sadly for Herman Miller, the shop itself only remained open for 2 years. And then the T&O concept kind of moved within our showrooms as they looked to continue to sell some of the goods. But I think what's amazing about Girard is that his spirit was kind of unbroken by all of this. Like, he remained really positive and really involved in everything that he was doing. There are so many other sort of overlapping projects as well. This is really, as with anything Girard, really just the tip of the iceberg. The next really big program was for Braniff Airlines, where Girard, I think, designed something like 17,000 different items over the course of like literally designing everything there is to design for an airline, from the plane's exterior and interior to the baggage tag.
To the typography, entire graphic program.
And Braniff was based in Dallas. They flew to Latin America. It may have been a good way for him to get cheaper tickets to do his collecting. But it's really interesting when they launched this program even that they were using the folk art as a signifier of the location. So those are like Panamanian objects. And really this folk art became almost like the brand identity, which is kind of great. But again, this sort of entered into the public sphere. The uniforms were by Pucci. Be sure and watch the Braniff strip up in the gallery. And all the seats in different textiles, some iconic ads with famous folks. Girard designed all of the lounges and waiting areas, and in the course of doing so, started to create sort of some custom furnishings, which Herman Miller produced. You can see his textiles and objects there in the spaces. Wonderful rosewood topped table, which would be nice to find someday. This one's interesting because it kind of looks like a hack with a leg from a compact sofa. Nice coffee table. The furniture was like, we had worked on this range, and it was at a point in time in Herman Miller's history where, again, they were sort of trying different things. Nelson and Eames were a little less involved in the day-to-day, and they were very involved with work with Girard, and they looked to commercialize that line of furnishings. This was prior to the launch of Action Office 2, which would obviously dominate Herman Miller's interests for years to come. And this had a sort of unfortunate timing of coming out about a year before that. So this furnishing, these pieces only were made for about a year, and they've become some of the most collectible Herman Miller items. There's a few wonderful examples upstairs. Hugh Dupree, the CEO at the time, had a really nice introduction letter in the press materials for this group, where he wrote, "We are also problem solving when we meet the need for beauty, joy, and excitement in living." It's a nice reminder that sort of problem solving can also be for those things.
This group of furniture as well, so imagine you're the consumer and you need to pick out, like, what do I want my Girard group to look like? And you had to choose various elements of the textiles, from the main cushion to the piping to what you want on the back. So I feel like something that would be perfect for Girard, who loves to layer color and pattern, was probably very scary for any of us to try and undertake. So
Especially considering Herman Miller's ordering system and numbering.
yeah.
Good luck entering the outside fabric and welt. But a wonderful range of furniture, some of which we've had the pleasure of reintroducing. In the course of our archival digging, came across these photos from the opening debut of the group in New York. Some sort of one-off pieces. If anyone can find this table with the Fornacetti-like top, we'd be delighted to speak with you.
Or any of this for that matter.
Girard, of course, continued designing textiles for this course of his tenure with Miller. But in 1972, as Action Office had really taken off, we're selling actually more textiles than ever because they had to cover the panels with textiles. So Mexicotton and some of these fabrics that he had designed were selling in quantities as they had never had before. And so there was this idea, though. He was doing work for Cummins and J. Irwin Miller at the time, designing offices, and he apparently had played with a sort of version of Action Office where all the components were done in different colors. He took it to Miller, and they said, look, that's kind of crazy, but we like these large-scale designs on some of these panels. What if we looked at that? Here you can see some of the stripes in a Action Office flipper. Mr. Eames, by the way, referred to Action Office as honest ugly, so keep that in mind. So it did need some environmental enriching. This is actually my favorite. This is the meta panel. This was available. It was called Sign, but is the Sign fabric panels designed by Mr. Girard. Here he is at work with his magic marker and or Sharpie.
These are other pieces that we've recently found with our friends in the Henry Ford that were rolled up. So the original drawings and blueprints that were used to make these are safely at the Henry Ford.
This is the series of 40 that eventually ended up being presented. And they were available for a good amount of time. You could get them just as loose hanging panels. You could get them stretched over a frame. You could get them attached to your Action Office where they would enrich your environment. Here are a few of them on view. Her environment need a little enrichment. There's a project, I believe, in Colorado, Kent Library. That is a sort of interior design that Mr. Girard did at the time, featuring an sort of extensive use of the panels. Also interesting, it's kind of like a boiled down bit of his ethos in this sort of institutional way, but you still see like little nichos and some of his tricks. Stars on the ceiling is always a good one. Love these nichos there. Another thing that we've sort of recently uncovered is this mural design done for the Herman Miller showroom in New York in roughly 1973, 1974. Which in some ways, like Girard has a history of doing corporate murals. There's some at Cummins. And
John Deere, which you can see the mock-up for upstairs.
And this one, in some sense, unfortunately, there are very few decent images of it because, as you can see, it was in a very dark, windowless hallway. But an incredible kind of collage of his whole output for Miller. In sort of segue, I think Miller's direction changed significantly from 1973 really to the present day. So we make a significant jump. But I think what's really exciting about at least my time at Herman Miller is the fact that there is such an interest in the world of Mr. Girard and the sort of life and humor and spirit that he brought to modernism. And so as we began to reintroduce textiles and some of the furniture elements, we started collecting items again and putting together exhibits. The first of which was in our Chicago showroom for a trade show called Neocon. We then relaunched the environmental enrichment panels and some of the furnishings with our partners at Vitra, and had the wonderful occasion of doing a pop-up sort of exhibit and Girard-inspired living space, let's say, in New York, where Corey Alacial and I had the pleasure of spending the better part of 2 weeks immersed in this fantastic environment. But really an ability to tell the story, to display the textiles of the 20th century collection that Maharam has been diligently working on for the better part of the last 20 years. Obviously, it's great to bring Maharam into the Herman Miller family and in a way reunite that legacy. But as you can see, I think, and as you explore the exhibit upstairs, there's so much that's relevant still. It's really, in a way, timeless to his approach and that we can still learn from. I'm sad that we all can't go have a Café Girard after this. Our friends at La Colombe Coffee spent those 2 weeks with us making really nice hot, sort of like Mexican hot chocolate espresso. And then we had the good fortune to take this show on the road and bring it to Tokyo, where there's a sort of fanatical Girard collecting audience. So we were able to involve some of our Japanese friends and incorporate their collections into the display, including this great bit of ceramics from Giancarlo Tunsi Girard.
Steve, you see your bust there?
Yes, Mr. Frickholm lent us his bust that was a gift from Max Dupree. But it's been really great to be able to kind of share this around the world. I think the thing that we learned in Japan that's really a message that's sort of relevant for Mr. Girard is that the work speaks for itself in any language. It always puts a smile on somebody's face. And then finally, as a kind of return to, in a way, the spirit of the textile and objects shop, our current flagship store in New York was very much inspired by the world of Mr. Girard and his ability to put things together in a significant way. And we continue to be inspired by Mr. Girard. Actually, this mirror is one that we found images of in the T&O shop. It was our shop at opening. The banner was there as well, which was great. And as you can see, like it's been really great to fold in that legacy today. I'm going to take the opportunity to reintroduce Corey Nalatial. Here we are at the opening at Vitra. And we're going to now segue into some conversation about what they do and their grandmother. So thank you.
Well, first of all of it's very personal for us, and people often ask us what was it like to be, living in the world of Alexandra Girard, both in their house and their home and the way they saw everything, but then how that translated to our parents' home as well. And it wasn't something that we remarked upon as children. It was just what we were living and what we were absorbing. And I think, without it being a super specific anecdote, just going to the house was always this magical experience of, it was formal on one hand, and you definitely had to be dressed in your best dress and be very polite and ready with your manners at the door. And then once we were across the threshold, we'd sit in, it wasn't a conversation pit at that house at that point, but the seating area, and we were served ginger ale with round ice cubes in these special glasses with bubbles suspended in them from Mexico. And you kind of had your initial conversation of how you were doing and what was happening in school, and then they sort of silently released you to just be free in this house. And there was breakable stuff everywhere and valuable stuff everywhere, and we were never watched over in this way of don't touch that and don't, stay right here and be still. You were really allowed to explore anywhere you wanted to, knowing that you had to be careful with what you were doing. And one of the first objects we would always go to check if it was still there was this wooden box that our grandfather had carved the bottom of to fit the top of a monkey skull. So you'd open the monkey skull and see where the brain had been encased, and it was just endlessly fascinating as a kid, and it was sort of like, check that out, make sure that was still there. And then, just wander throughout the rooms. So that's a really fond part of our childhood in general.
Yeah, I think just to build on that story, that there was also moments where you could he was always happy to be pulled away from the adult conversation and to be, taken with us through the house, and kind of, I remember, you know, because there were so many things, I remember him, you know, pointing out things and basically teaching us to notice, which is something that is rare in today's day and age. I think we move through the culture in a very speedy kind of, you know, directive way, and, you know, I think he was a champion of slowing down and noticing as much as he could around him to create the inspiration that he needed to delve into all of these different types of projects. And I certainly, you know, thank him for pointing out all the things that he did.
Did you guys ever break anything?
Never.
We didn't?
No, I mean, I don't have any memory of breaking anything. Maybe my dad has a different memory. But
I don't know.
there was also, they made
My
sure.
dad definitely broke stuff,
Well.
that's for sure.
There was also in the storage wall that was in the dining room, at the very bottom right-hand cubby was a place that was just ours, that they would constantly refill with new toys and things that we were completely allowed to play with and toss about, and they were made specifically for children, and so that was always a place we would go check as well, and they had, you know, made that. He was big on making things accessible to your size as a child, so they would never put anything high up on a shelf and expect us to ask for that, but that we could get there and be autonomous in that way. And in the museum, the Folk Art Museum, you'll notice too, for those of you who've been and those of you hopefully will get to go at some point, many of the exhibits are down on a child's level so that you can get that view without feeling like you're in the adult world. So he very much considered children in everything he did.
Can you remind us what the children had to say to be excused from the table?
Oh, were you hoping that was the anecdote?
No, it just came to mind as you mentioned your best behavior.
Well, our grandfather was very whimsical and humorous and silly and loved riddles, and you could kind of crawl into his lap and you know, listen to a funny story. But our grandmother, on the other hand, was sort of she upheld the manners and the propriety and the just a little more formality about everything, and they really coupled one another in a beautiful way in that sense. But if you had to go to the bathroom, you had to say, "May I please be excused to go to Paris?" Which was fine, because the bathrooms were as amazing as any other part of the house. So
that might be a nice segue to talk about Susan a little bit, since we've spent so much time talking about Sandro. I think it is clear that there's such a kinship and the spirit that drifts through the work, that connection. How do you feel as a sort of descendant? Like, what did you take from your grandmother? What have you inherited from her?
Well, we're working on a piece right now, actually, for Maharam, specifically about her and her role in his career, but also her role as just who she was in her own right. And it feels particularly relevant as we deal with the potential loss of women's rights that have been worked hard for. Right now, with what's going on politically, to recognize her in her own right, not as just the support for him, but in somebody who was just as visionary and just had her own strong opinions, was not afraid to share them, and really ran the backbone of the way that the office worked and the logistical end of things, and making sure people were getting paid. And so that's one aspect of it, of just being this sort of strong but humble voice and advocate for him in his career and what he was able to do. And then also just remarkably stylish and so kind, even though she also had a formality about her, and somebody that was very loyal and was on top of everything. I mean, that's what I remember, somebody who just held everything down, knew what was happening at all times, a fantastic cook. I mean, there's really so many things that we've been able to take from her. And you have your own.
Yeah, I mean, I would also just say that aside from, I mean, she was an incredible, she had an incredible sensibility and design forward way of thinking as well. I think in design, presentation becomes such a huge aspect, and she was such an incredible host and presenter, and they really together always were presenting what they had both kind of worked hard for. So
Why, why now? Apart from the fact that it's probably taken this long to get through the archive and document it at Vitra, why do you think this is such a ripe moment for us to like revisit the world of Girard?
I mean, I think you could visit the world of Girard at any moment and it would be completely relevant. And I think that's because the world of Girard wasn't just the world of Girard. He was one of the better, he loved to pedestal other artists and to notice the world around him and the globe at large. And I think as we become, more of a global village than we ever had, it becomes more important to kind of notice and, accept and tolerate all of the different ways of thinking or creating or existing on this common, spinning rock that we're all here on. So yeah, I think it's very relevant for that reason today and will be continually relevant for that reason.
I think that's probably the most potent. Aside from things like his color sensibility and his understanding of texture and pattern and layering and all of these things, as you all remarked on in the slideshow, that he was way ahead of his time, and now people are feeling more comfortable with things like bold, bright, all of that. But I think the cross-cultural understanding that he believed in and lived so deeply, and that comes through all of the work. It's like you said, in Japan, we were there giving tours, but actually we didn't have to say anything. People got it just through the work, and that's amazing. And when you go to the folk art, you'll see that his intention was to have no labels on anything, so that you didn't have to go and see, oh, this is from Peru and this is from South Africa. You just experienced it for what it was, and the joy that it brought you, or the memory that it brought you, or the curiosity that it inspired. But it didn't really matter where it was from, and you could make a guess and think for sure it was from Mexico, and then go check the guide that they had to add because people were so curious, and it would be from India, and you were so sure, and then in the end, that's the point. So
I think one other point just to mention is that, for many years we struggled to relay the breadth of the career and the many different facets of how he worked and how he was influenced, and it was always a mouthful to convince anybody of. And I think with the release first of the Todd Oldham book and then the Vitra catalog, now we have a document which speaks entirely for itself and kind of includes all of these aspects of the career, which were really hard to describe in any short conversation. And I think now it's a bit out of our hands, and anyone who takes the chance to look through the books can really make that conclusion for themselves that this is a vast body of work that is very important to so many aspects of how we are aesthetically moving through the world today. So.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that my take has always been that it's the work was ephemeral in some sense. Like a restaurant interior goes away because the restaurant fails, right? Or like the textile on the sofa isn't remembered, but the sofa may be.
Sure.
So I think that too is accounts for some of the dip in the knowledge. But what was amazing as we've dug through things is the extent to which he was sort of celebrated and renowned at the time. Seemingly did anything, it got press.
Right.
But somehow that got lost where others managed to, the acclaim sort of grew.
Part
over
of
time.
that is the diversity of what he was able to do, and I think it's hard for people to comprehend or categorize someone like him because there wasn't anybody doing so many different facets of that in the way. And still today, it's hard to find a person that takes on that many different kinds of projects in the holistic capacity that he did. And so you end up focusing on one thing. And we often get that, oh, he was a textile designer, right? And it's like, yeah, that's the very tip of the iceberg, And being able to tell all of the story all through history, it is difficult. But
is there an emphasis now, maybe we can talk a little bit about your role as Girard Studio, in obviously you're responsible for telling that story. Is there a particular emphasis that you've found helpful to be that spearhead to that at least, or are you have a sort of, what's your 5-year plan? No, do you have a strategy for how you can get the world to know the breadth of that story?
Well, like Corey mentioned, first of all, partnering with Vitra and Herman Miller and Maharam has really been amazing in that they are there doing their work in the world at such a high level of quality and integrity and true to the original vision of what our grandfather designed or thought. That's really important for us. That helps us because just as the family, you know, you don't have as much reach as you do with global companies. So that's one aspect of it, is the partnerships that we've chosen to align with and feel very supported by and interact with in great relationships is really key. And then I think continuing to tell the story on a human level so that it feels accessible for anybody and everybody, which the work does itself, but when you tell a story about it, it becomes even more approachable in that way. So we do a lot of speaking engagements. We're interested in furthering education, especially for children, younger children. One of the best parts of the Vitra show was watching groups of school children from all over that European area come through the show and listening to the tours and seeing their reactions to it. And that's something we're really interested in continuing to promote. Yeah.
A strategy, I think there's different strategies at different times. It's had to fluctuate a lot just based on, you know, how art history works and what interest is at different times, and, you know, the market in terms of people buying product and us redeveloping product for modern ways of manufacturing and all of the questions that come up. I think it's quite an overwhelming undertaking, or it can be. I think we've found a stride with it a bit in the last couple of years. And I think that one of the things is if we release a product, or if there's a redo of something that he did, that whoever we work with to do that, the consideration of the story and how that tells, some unique aspect of what happened, if that's incorporated, then that's our criteria for what a project looks like, or at least that's how we start. And I think we've been fairly successful in kind of narrowing our collaborations to people that really care about and see the value of describing the personal story, and kind of how, you know, I don't want to say forgotten, because I think the right people never forgot, at least key people never forgot. I shouldn't say the right people, but I think, you know, how he influenced the other people around him. It was a heavyweight group there that was working together, and I think that certainly the Eames were much sort of more interested in the limelight, moving to Los Angeles at, you know, around the same time that he moved to New Mexico. New Mexico is virtually, you still find people on either end of the coast that don't know that New Mexico is a part of the United States. And so I think back then it was even more exotic. You know, what are you doing? Where are you going? You know, whereas Los Angeles was just only on the rise. And so I think he was, you know, he was also okay with the idea that he wasn't, you know, there wasn't mass notoriety around the work. I think he was more interested in what was the most interesting next project, and how was he staying engaged, and how was he challenging himself, and how was he diversifying his, you know, life work. And so
from your knowledge, there's this huge side of the collecting that we really barely touched on from a commercial standpoint, but is obviously evident a bit upstairs and truly in Santa Fe at the Museum of Folk Art. What's your understanding of, like, was he selecting a destination, like, I'm going to do a trip to Egypt and Ethiopia, or was that driven by a project, like, I'm going to go and collect for Braniff, or I'm going to go and collect for the Fonda del Sol?
I think the fascination started way before there were any projects based on including folk art in the final presentation. I think that his father was an antiquarian, and so long before he was interested in it, he was coming from a legacy of collecting and selecting. And I think, you know, also being born in, he was born in New York, but grown up in Florence, you know, it has a high regard for, you know, fine objects. And I think, you know, that just, you know, you see examples of him being interested in other cultures from very early on in the work, but it was not only based on the project's direction that he was interested in going to, say, Ethiopia. I mean, I don't think there was any project asking him to go to Ethiopia, and certainly not to take his son to Ethiopia at that time, where, you know, there was virtually no paved road for a tourist, you know, to visit that country, and certainly not to ship back objects. So you look at his innovation, you can talk about his innovation in collecting or this or that, but also shipping innovation was incredible. I mean, not only would he buy the entire cart of dolls, he would then have to spend time teaching the people how to pack it so that only a percentage of it broke when it arrived back in Santa Fe.
And I think it's important too to understand that he collected everything. He didn't just collect folk art. So from a very early age, you know, when we went, there was a room attached to the second home in Santa Fe where we grew up going called the Foundation, that was, I don't remember the dimensions, but it was
5,000 square foot cinder block room with one door and no windows.
right.
It's basically like a vault attached to the side of the house.
And we would occasionally get to go through the heavy door that led in there, and it was, Amy speaks about him as an archivist, everything was immaculately organized and labeled and in drawers and tiny pullouts and all of that. And when you'd start to go through it, I mean, you'd have like candy wrappers that had been ironed flat that were made from tin with the amazing fonts. You'd have shells from every beach you'd ever been to, each one categorized by where it came from, the date it was collected. I mean, you know, everything. So it wasn't just folk art to be displayed at some point. It really expanded beyond that. And it's a family legacy that I don't think any of us can totally help otherwise, because his brother, Tunsi, who we called Uncle Jinx, actually lived in Florence, and we spent a great deal of our childhood going to spend time with him. He was also an avid collector that organized and labeled everything with the most amazing precision. So,
Well,
yeah.
you see it now when you have to interact with the archival material. He showed his work.
Yeah.
And so you're able, if you're working with a harem or whomever, you're truly able to go back and revisit the process in such a
Right.
tangible way because of what you're describing, of just saving everything, but in a way better way than anyone ever could, in terms of making it accessible and make sense to people accessing it, you know, going through Vitra. What we have to do now with Herman Miller, it's just the order that exists is mind-numbing.
Totally remarkable.
What have been, in the course of now your adult lives, like that sounds like an incredible experience, what has resurfaced that's been really surprising as you've spent time with his work or his collections? Is there anything that stands out?
Well, I'll tell one story more about my brother's work, but when we were at Vitra at one point, I think maybe I was 16 and you were 18, and we were digging through some of the archives that some of it had, I mean, as Sam mentioned, it took many, many years to unfurl everything that was given there and categorize it and archive it properly and digitize and everything. And we were going through some old legal pad drawings, just random sketches. And there was this face that came up that looked like something that Corey would have drawn. And we were both kind of stopped in our tracks because we'd never seen anything like it. It was from, you know, the 50s. And here he was making these drawings that couldn't have possibly have been influenced by in a visual sense that way. I think that's always interesting when these things just sort of come out. I mean, we're both creative in our own right, and definitely, I don't know that we chose that. It's just what we do. It's what we've always done. We've always drawn. We've always designed things. We've always been facilitated by our father. Any project that we wanted to do, any idea that we had from the earliest age, you go down to the workshop and you try to make it.
Yeah.
And there wasn't really, I think there wasn't so much explaining, which sometimes was really annoying, but I think in the end is okay. But there was a lot of just sort of, this is how you do it, sit there and watch, and then, you know, basically it's not, you have to draw, you have to do this. There wasn't a lot of words, like you said. There was more just, you know, sitting, watching my father use the tools or make a drawing, which, you know, if you ask him, he'll directly tell you was from sitting there watching his father use the tools. And I think sometimes we're trying to change that a little bit, just in terms of like being able to describe how to use something as opposed to just watching. But I think, you know, nonetheless, we, you know, learned so much through that, and it's been, you know, an incredible, you know, gift.
I think you've also, I mean, you can speak for yourselves, had as creative people who are also responsible for this incredible legacy, which is obviously in its scope and scale quite daunting. Being able to balance those things, can you tell us a little bit about your own creative pursuits and like how you do that?
It's an ongoing practice, for sure, of finding time between all the different pursuits that we have. We recently kind of constructed a new studio space that acts as the headquarters for Girard's studio, but then is also a working art studio that we both can be in together. We often, we've collaborated in the past on certain things, but it's more like we make our own work and then we review it with one another, and it's really great to have a space now dedicated to be able to do that and check out what's going on with each other's work. And we were lucky enough when we did the show in Tokyo that Sam mentioned, we also separately had a show at a gallery there along with work of my father's, which was really great to be able to present all together. And all of our work is very different and yet very obviously connected.
Yeah, I would say that all that is true, and I would say that I think one of the things I've been recognizing recently is that I'm really thankful that there wasn't so much focus on the specialness of being a creative person. We weren't ever told that our grandfather was somebody special or somebody to be revered because he was a creative person. It was more just like, that's how he lives. And it's kind of the same humility that my father's come with, and I think we didn't even see a majority of the work until our mid-20s. So at that point, we were already engaged in our own creative practices. I'm very thankful for that, because had we seen what we saw in our mid-20s earlier on, it may have been more daunting to kind of start a creative practice or two. So I think it's just something that was kind of taught, you know, through osmosis.
I think he did that on purpose from wherever he exists now, that we didn't find it until later and that we were able to find our own path. And I think we say this often when we speak to people, he would be really upset to think that we gave up what we wanted to do or what we were pursuing in our own creative right to just manage what he did. And as Sam said, many of the projects were ephemeral in this way, where once they were done, they may disappear because the restaurant goes out of business or whatever. I don't think that mattered. He was on to the next thing in the same way that I think he would want us to keep pursuing the next thing that we're interested in, and whatever idea we have to run with it and to be passionate and convicted about it. So.
Yeah, I think our stewardship would be more promoted by our grandmother than our grandfather, you know, and that may come from that side. And just because she was always concerned with him receiving the accolade that he was due for whatever project he was doing at the time.
So when we've done this in the past, we haven't had a fabulous exhibit upstairs for our audience to see. What, if you have to sum it up, would be the ideal thing that somebody takes away in their mind after they get to experience that?
I think maybe that he was so unafraid to try anything and everything, and it didn't matter if it were a massive project that he was being paid a lot of money to do, or a small gift he was going to give his wife that was not intended for anybody else to see. He paid attention to the detail at all times, and you see that in the show, and you see the vast diversity of objects and things that he designed. And I think really caring about taking pride in your work is probably the biggest takeaway that I hope people are inspired by and excited about.
Yeah, I think, you know, want to just, not to keep repeating myself, but this idea of noticing the world around you and slowing down and finding ways to make your life more personal or more meaningful through. It doesn't have to be something that you spend a lot of money on. It just has to be something that you have a certain connection with, a feeling from. And I think that is what I'm most inspired by through seeing the exhibit, is this constant, you know, curiosity for what can enrich our lives to be a more meaningful and more kind of accepting, tolerant existence. So. Yeah.
That is a nice note for us to part on, but I want to also open up to the audience who may have some questions to ask of any of us. Yes?
I'm curious You talked about your father and his designs. Tell us about them and their creative pursuits.
Well, we are actually really fortunate to hold two very important, amazing legacies, and we don't talk about our mothers in these contexts very much because it's not necessarily relevant directly to Girard, but her family, they were Lebanese and came to New Mexico in the late 1800s and developed the first movie theater in the state of New Mexico, and then went on to do other real estate development. If any of you have ever been to Santa Fe, the Lenzic Theater downtown is part of our family legacy on that side. And similar to our grandparents, my mother and my father were very different from one another, are very different, but really couple each other in a nice way. And my father built beautiful custom adobe homes in Santa Fe for 35 years. And she very much helped support that while she was also managing her own family's real estate legacy. And his creative pursuits, I don't know if you like me talking for you, but he's a sculptor. He's an artist, and so it's like our grandfather. It's hard to define it into one thing. He really can take any material, anywhere, anytime, and make something happen. Recently, we were in Mendocino. We live in Berkeley, California, so we'd gone a little bit north I have two daughters, and we're walking on the beach, and my youngest one, a 5-year-old, picked up a stick that looked like nothing remarkable, shaggy with seaweed and the whole thing, and hands it to him and said, "Here you go, Pappy, will you make me something?" And 2 weeks later, we get back his version of a Kokeshi doll, which is just stunningly carved. And, totally, at this point, I hope she's not taking it for granted, but, and then she said, "Can I have a bunny next?" She's just on it. So there is that sense of and I think it impacts them. It impacts my eldest daughter the other day said something about my handwriting, and you really care about everything that you write. I do. It's just part of what we do, and I hope to impart that in a non-pressureful way of just caring about that. But that's a little bit about our parents, and I don't know if you'd like to add.
Well, I think I would say, to mimic what you said, that both of them are major inspiration and influence for us in our own pursuits, and I think they both have, I don't know if it's equal, but definitely major, parts to them that we follow and respect greatly. So I think they're both creative in their own right. My father certainly is he's more than creative. He's like a living work of art, if you ever get a chance. He doesn't talk a lot, so that's why we're up here. But he's talked a lot to us, and he's given us a lot of stories and a lot of power to come and be up here and speak freely, and thankful for that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Is there any plan for the vault that, like the collections in the vault that you mentioned, just like large space of all of the things that Girard collected?
So upon our grandmother's death, and she passed away after my grandfather, as was mentioned, his design archive went to Vitra, which was their wishes. The rest of it that was personal bits, we have some of that in our own keeping, but it wasn't necessarily all kept together because some of it had to do with the design, some of it was personal.
I think maybe you were thinking about the collections of folk art and things like this.
Like the shelves.
Yeah. So there's a lot of that was gifted to the state of New Mexico for people who aren't familiar, and that museum is a permanent installation, unchanging, that you can go and visit at any time. It's open regular hours, and below that there is a large, for every single object that is shown on display in the museum, there are maybe 100 of variations in the basement. So for the actual extensive collection, it's lent out for different shows around the world, but not as what's so magical about the Museum of International Folk Art is it's really a precursor to installation design or exhibition design, and it really is a singular piece of artwork done by him with thousands of other people's artwork, and it's really it's really something that if you're interested in seeing the collections, is such a great example, and you can see so many aspects just by visiting that in Santa Fe.
But also, I think what's remarkable, like numerically in Santa Fe, in the installation you designed, it's roughly like 10,000 objects. The complete collection was 106,000. So that gives you some sense of the scale.
And to speak to the other parts like shells and sand, and a lot of that's actually used in the installation too, because he would collect sand from a place that he wanted to actually be the sand in that portion of the exhibition, or the shells on that beach where the dolls are standing, so that sort of thing.
The sort of layers of scale in the installation are incredible, because of course the whole thing is the whole thing, but just down to sort of like the placement of a Parliament cigarette in one of the exhibits, like there's all these kind of moments throughout where like at a micro scale, he's done something super purposeful.
With the 3 architecture degrees, you really also get to see him building out these spaces for the folk art to exist in. So you have, these folk art pieces from Mexico of these women making tortillas, but then he builds the kitchen that they're standing in to make those tortillas, and it's immaculate.
It's
like,
as impressive as the Fonda del Sol on a scale like this.
Every terracotta brick is made by him and then stuccoed into the stucco wall, and then it's immaculate. It's really extensive. So
As I said, you have to go. Anyone else? Up the top.
Aside from his artistic abilities, he had a gift for collecting and categorizing everything. What type of staff did he have to help with this? And do you happen to know on a personal side how much sleep he required?
yeah, it's a very common question. Did he sleep? And our father says he did. We don't know exactly. The studio was always attached to the home, as was the collection processing room. So that was very intentional in that he could kind of go and come from the studio at different times and always still be a part of the family environment as well. And I think that had a lot to do with that in terms of, what was the first question, cataloging?
Yeah, how much staff? He always had a small staff working in his office, never massive amounts of people, and changing depending on expertise that he needed per project. And then in terms of processing things as it came in, there were people that helped with that, my father being one of them, as well as his sister. And I think...
Yeah, in terms of staff, I think he was, from what we understand, was very strict with his work schedule, but also set aside times to be social and to connect. And I think he wanted people that he worked with to have a personal connection with him. It was never, if he asked you to do something, it was because he understood all that was going into what he was asking you to do. He was not a fan, neither was my father, of asking people to do things that, just because you didn't want to or something like that. It was usually, people were brought on when he could just physically not create whatever he was.
He also worked with a lot of outside craftsmen, like at the La Fonda del Sol. There's great records and even articles about the iron, like wrought iron is done by this person,
Right.
and the brass work was done by this person.
Yeah,
and
he
it's
was a
done by this
master
person.
delegator,
And-
which is also a major talent to have.
At Herman Miller, we've just been talking about a gentleman by the name of Claire Hintz, who had the exact same tenure as Girard and was really his main point of contact with Miller, and ran the textile program essentially from a business side. But those relationships, I think, are so important
Yeah,
in,
absolutely.
in
And
the work.
I think
And-
he understood that really well too. There was no ego involved in him having to do every last thing. He knew when he could give parts off so that he could facilitate getting so much done. And that includes what my grandmother did to run parts of the office and the home life and everything else, all the socializing. And my mother was just telling me recently that people would just show up in Santa Fe and look them up in the phone book and cold call and say, "We really love you, can we come meet you?" And my grandmother would just put it on, she'd, okay, sure, come on over, open the house, have people for cocktails. Unbelievably open to that, to sharing of the work and to allowing people to have a glimpse, which is really incredible. Yeah.
It all sounds very spiritual. Were they ever unhappy or angry or disappointed?
Of course. course. I mean, yeah, it's kind of like Instagram. I don't know if you're on Instagram. People don't often post the outside of the photo that didn't look so pretty. It's focused on but of course it was real life, and he traveled a ton and was gone to do that a lot. And as was our grandmother, often went with him. And, you know, it was not, I think it was a constant hustle to continue to get the work that you wanted to do and keep on that. And, you know, being far away from both of their families, because his family was in Italy and she left hers behind in New York, and it wasn't, obviously you could travel, but it wasn't super financially viable to constantly be going back to those places. So there's a lot of really beautiful correspondence that goes back between them in letters expressing how much they missed home and how much missed being around them. And yeah, I'm sure they had all.
Yeah, he was extremely human on every level. I mean, spiritual, but not religious, and, you know, was well aware of all sides of the coin, and you see that in his work. It's the kind of happier moments are definitely highlighted, but if you dig deep, you see him fully recognizing the more difficult parts of life, and he wasn't about glossing everything over. He was somebody that liked to go into, you know, directly into people's lives and connect and figure out what made them tick, and that's always trauma mixed with delight, you know, so, yeah.
I was just curious to know to what extent, if at all, being based in the Southwest, in Santa Fe, in the Southwest, informed his work, or may not. I think the fact that he travels so much and that his work on many levels is abstract in a way that it's hard to see where he's being driven, like in terms of, you know, his type designs and in the range. But it's hard not for any creative person to live in the Southwest because it's and not be influenced to some degree by the landscape and the uniqueness of the culture of the landscape.
I think he was greatly influenced by it. I think he moved there for it, for inspiration and for proximity to Mexico and the rest of Latin America. I think he felt a real kinship with not only the visual that you're speaking about, the light and the landscape and the sky and the colors of the earth and the adobe architecture, but also the cultures that existed there, the Native American cultures and the Hispanic cultures that had been rooted there for many, many, many years. I mean, he spent tons of time on Native American reservations of all different kinds, developing relationships with artisans there. He was a huge walker. He loved to just walk and wander and would go and collect pottery shards and crystals and all of that kind of thing. I mean, he was very much inspired by that land in so many ways. And I think also when you walk through the Folk Art Museum, there are often times when you can see a direct correlation between a color combination or a classic shape or something that, you know, he was not worried about saying what he was influenced by.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with that. I would say he was incredibly influenced by the Southwest, and it was a major draw. I think that there's a freedom, and it still exists in the sky in a way, or in the land. It's a big land with a big sky, and it's got a very magical feeling being there for so many different reasons that even today still exist. But I think, you know, one of my favorite examples of the direct influence was with the graphic geometry of the Navajo woven pieces, which he collected in depth. And, you know, part of his reason for moving there was because you could still go to these trading posts where no one else had been and, you know, collect things that were clearly to him, you know, wildly exciting, and then also pull that influence directly into the geometrics that he was creating for, you know, textiles of his own, you know.
Yeah, you could see like the Starry Night.
Yeah, exactly. The big sky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just hard not to spend any time down there and not being overwhelmed by it. So I imagine.
Yeah, a lot of people come there and never painted anything, and all of a sudden they want to get their first
Their
watercolor
church.
set. Yeah, it's like it's.
It is the land of enchantment.
Yeah, yeah, or
As the license plate says.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You haven't mentioned very much about roots in 20th century design that affected him. And I can't help thinking about the Bauhaus, the spirit of the Bauhaus. Did he acknowledge any of that kind of history? I'm thinking about the permission that many of those artists gave to the kind of exploration that I see evolving in his work.
I can testify that, like, as a student at the Royal College of Art or Architectural Association in London, I think, and also he was a designer of an Italian pavilion for the 1928 World's Fair, where the Mies van der Rohe Barcelona pavilion is, of course, remembered from. I think I read in Mr. Eisenbrand's essay in the new catalog that he signed architectural drawings at the time with like a triangle for an a square for an H, and a circle for a G. And in fact, on the cover of the Herman Miller textile binder that we showed, there's a square, a circle, and a triangle, which is a nice connection. But I think, you know, like his real ability was to sort of synthesize from both, obviously, like what the modernists were doing, but also what a Hopi artisan might have been doing, and synthesizing it into something like incredibly unique and in its own way very modern, but without this sort of notion of without a reference to the past.
I would say too, I mean, the Albers were hanging out with the Eameses, and presumably they all knew each other, knew of each other's work, so I don't see how you couldn't sort of at least be somewhat absorbent or aware of what else was going on.
Here in Detroit, he was obviously connected with the Saarinen. He designed a home with Yamasaki. He was listed as a project architect at the beginning of the Jefferson expansion, the St. Louis Arch, and was involved a lot with Saarinen. So there is a great connection to other contemporary designers.
I think he was really good at understanding what wasn't being done at the time, and then taking up, you know, finding a place to shine. You know, I think there was so much credit being given, you know, at that time in his circle to particular people. He wanted to highlight, he wanted to find the place that was in the dark and have that experience of that freshness of inviting people to see these connections past just this high art, high respected, you know, scholarship work to, you know, how do you see the connection between the Navajo and what they were doing and the Bauhaus, you know, because it's definitely there. There's no, you know, it's 100% clear in my mind.
I don't think he was as concerned with drawing those connections like academically or in publications, or he made the work to make the work and let you make your own decision about how you related to it, what it reminded you of, what it evoked, what it was inspired by.
There's a great line in that same Fonda del Sol sort of FAQ. He writes, "This project is entirely successful at being exactly what it intends to be."
And he had a Picasso lithograph show in Michigan at his studio, and I don't remember the year, but I think he was not, it wasn't that he wasn't interested in fine art, and I think there's even writing describing him making the choice not to be a fine artist and to go, you know, down the path of a designer instead.
I'm curious about the relationship between the designers and the businesses, because especially back then, there was that relationship. It was a partnership. And so did he understand personally if a business, you know, that reflected his aesthetic didn't succeed or didn't fulfill the expectations of the business? Or do you have any, I'm just curious, because there was almost that relationship that at least designers try to follow.
Yeah, it was definitely different than it is now. You know, I mean, the studio was always outside of the company, you know, which is much different than you see a lot of the designers working now that are, the designer's name isn't pedestaled, you know, it's, you're kind of under the umbrella of the company. And I think that, you know, he was, as Sam mentioned, he was personally involved with everybody at Herman Miller and very interested. But I think there's also like this balance between caring what the consumer and the mass wants, and then knowing that you also have to push those limits in those ways of, that's where you find the newness, the kind of your own interpretation. So it's both a balance of caring and also not caring what the company thinks, I think, even for designers today.
But personally, I'm just,
Well, I think it goes back to the same idea of he was always on to the next thing, and when you look through the projects in a chronological order, you can see the kind of stepping stones that when he would take a piece from the last project and kind of go a whole nother direction, kind of blow it to the next level with the next project. And I think he was happy to have the next project, and if it didn't work out for you, well, that was okay, because he's on to this next project, and he got to work more of his ideas out I think the consistency, he finished the Folk Art Museum sort of as the culmination of his career, and he was still trying to calculate exactly the age, but late 70s, still going strong with a clear vision of what he was doing. And there, I don't think there was a lot of talk back unless someone was specifically asking him about some project that did or didn't still exist. So he was very optimistic. You say it all sounds spiritual in a way. He was very optimistic and very forward-looking in that way. Oh.
Yes. The
With
environmental
Herman Miller?
panels are probably the last work.
Yeah.
But they remained then. There was a show at the Walker Art Museum in 1975, which Girard contributed sort of the layout of his own contribution to that show, which was titled Nelson, Eames, Girard, and Probst, the design process of Herman Miller. He then donated his textile archive to Herman Miller, and the relationship seemed to stay somewhat intact through the 80s. But if obviously, like, Herman Miller changed directions, some of the casement fabrics remained in the program through that time period, but then things changed. Clino Castelli arrived with his own ideas about textiles. Great.
I'd like to thank everyone for coming out this afternoon, sharing the experience, and I would like to thank our participants. Thank you, Amy, Corey, Alashal, and Sam. It's been really wonderful. Thank you.